Ooh, it worked. Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you can just throw in the chat bar on the side that you can hear us and good morning or something fun. Good morning. Awesome. Last time me and Nat and I went and started a session, we couldn't actually get into the session. So it's a good thing we actually got in this time. We are not tech gurus by any means. All right. So before, I'll give it a few more minutes just while other people are joining. But I'll introduce myself and I'll let Nat introduce himself. My name is Borden. I'm a health promotion specialist at CFB Borden. I've been with the organization for about a year now, or just over. And today we're going to be doing part 4 of Mission Nutrition. So we'll be talking more about label reading as well as nutrients and kind of how they play a role in how we decide what we eat. And I'll send it over to Nat to introduce himself.
So good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Nat. It's Nathaniel Smith. I go by Nat. I'm also one of the health promotion specialists at the CFB Borden. I've been at Borden for a few more years than Braden. We'll can leave it at that. I'll be covering labels in a little bit of good detail a little bit later on. So hopefully we figure out a few new things around labels for you this morning.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. All right, there's a few more coming in. So like I mentioned, this is part 4 of our series. We've already kind of gone over how physical activity plays a role, goal setting, nutrients. We went over all the key nutrients, as well as kind of how to go about weight loss or weight management. So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about label reading more in depth. And how to make those informed decisions when you're at the grocery store looking at that label and not really knowing what to do with it. All right. So before we get started, we just have to go through a few kind of housekeeping things. So the content that we will be discussing today is part of the D&D property. So anything that we go over, or any slides that we go over, shouldn't be reproduced in any way. These slides will be available and this will be recorded and be available after the fact for you on CAF Connection. So if you want to see or go back to any of the content we're discussing today, you can do so by going through CAF Connection. As well, the content we're discussing today is more geared to adults. So we're talking about how to eat healthy as an adult, the needs that our body requires for the energy output is based on, the numbers are based on adult needs. With that being said, some content we might go over might be sensitive in nature to children, so just use your discretion with that. If there are little ones in the room with you, maybe throw some headphones in. As well, we don't really have the capability of sharing screens with others, so I think one other person can share their screen if they want to, or share their video if they want to, but that's all. So if you do want to, just put in the chat that you want to ask a question and you want to share your webcam, and we can do that for you. But know that it is being recorded. Anything you ask will be part of that recording, so just be mindful of that as well. If you kind of want your identifier out of it, just keep your microphone and recording off or webcam off. As well, I'm going to throw up a poll on how you're affiliated with the CAF community. So I know this is open to a lot of people, kind of out in the open, but we'd like to see kind of where you're coming from in terms of how we can gear the presentation to that. So we've got a lot of serving members as well as civilian employees, so that's great. Alrighty, so introduction. So as I mentioned, this is the fourth presentation of this series. We've kind of gone over a fair bit already. Hopefully you've attended some of the previous sessions. If not, we're going to do a little bit of an overview in terms of what nutrients are, what the 6 classifications are, and that will really help us to gear us up for when we talk about labels. So first, we'll talk about nutrients. We've already talked about it last week with Jess and Jackie, but we'll kind of just quickly go over some key things in terms of what we're looking for on a label in terms of those nutrients that we need. We'll also quickly, maybe 2 slides on the Canada's Food Guide and just talk about how that plays a role in the foods that we are choosing and how we read those labels. So if we know based on the Canada Food Guide that we need a certain number of or a certain amount of nutrients on our plate, that'll really help us inform us when we're choosing the foods that we are eating. And then where we're going to spend the majority of today's session is going to be on label reading. So we're going to talk, or Nat's going to talk mostly on what labels are, like what aspects are on them, as well as some changes that are happening right now and kind of going into the future, how they're more user-friendly for us. So Nat will be discussing that with us shortly. All right, so what is health? Throw in the chat bar, I know this happened last week, but throw in the chat bar what healthy eating means to you. Because it really is kind of individual. You know, our body needs different things based on the activity we're doing, where we are in our stage of life, all of these different aspects. But generally speaking, healthy eating is nutrients, so what our body needs to be able to do the things that we want to do and maintain itself, as well as eating the right foods in the right amounts. So it's really about that balance that we need in order to get those foods in the right amounts. I will quickly go over this in terms of, we know that the background behind healthy eating is really, really important. We know that we get our energy needs from eating healthy and the foods that we eat. We know our recovery time is sped up if we're eating nutritiously. It's kind of that, you know, social, like it plays a huge role in all aspects of our life. We know that it's linked to mental health and mental alertness and focus. So if we're eating a balanced and healthy, nutritious diet, we're more likely to be focused, be productive at work, be able to work out harder and stronger and fuel our body for the needs, as well as for disease prevention. So we know that eating a balanced and healthy diet, and we'll touch on key aspects of that, but how that plays a role in disease prevention in terms of like heart attack, stroke, cancers. I touched on mental health already. So all of these aspects play a role in disease prevention. All right, so here are the key nutrients that our body needs. Generally speaking, I think all of us tend to go to those carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and we forget about the vitamins, minerals, and water, but not to be forgotten because they are very important. So generally speaking, those carbs, proteins, and fats are where we're going to get our energy sources from. So those are going to be parts of the foods that we eat, and those are going to be what fuel our body for performance or just waking up in the morning and moving. We're also going to talk about water in a second, of how important water is for our bodies, and how important it is for our functions, all of our functions and performance. Nat, feel free to jump in anytime.
Sure.
All right, so if we're looking at fluid, fluid is really important for our body in so many different ways. So if we're looking at transport and temperature control, very, very important, as well when we're looking at performance. So if we're able to perform and do physical activity, our body needs water to be able to do that. So we know that there's a performance decrease if we're dehydrated or not meeting those water needs. As well, water can come from different sources. So Canada's Food Guide says water should be the drink of choice when we're drinking or having a drink next to our food. But also fluid can come from different sources, such as, you know, coffees, teas, soups, smoothies, kind of a variety of sources. So within that target of 2 liters per day, and that's an average, that can come from multiple sources. So, you should be making water the drink of choice, but included in that can be your teas and coffees and soups and things like that. As well, very important to note that if we are physically active, we not only need those 2 liters of water a day, but we also need an extra amount for the water loss from our physical activity. So being mindful of that, if you, go for a run and it's hot and you're sweating, you're going to need to replenish that water that you've lost through sweat. All right, so kind of the number 2 is carbohydrate. So carbohydrate generally make up the majority of our foods, or 45 to 65% of our needs. So if we kind of think about that in terms of label reading, we'll think about, carbohydrates are very needed for our bodies when we're looking at it. And then we'll make that decision when we're looking at label reading later on. So carbohydrate is really important for blood glucose. So it's able to fuel our brain, fuel our bodies, fuel us and give us energy to be able to go on with our day. Really, really important if we are doing physical activity to be getting enough carbohydrate into our diet to fuel that energy or fuel that exercise. As well, for muscle fuel, carbohydrate gets turned into glycogen for our muscles, so also very important for physical activity. Where we kind of see carbohydrate seen as negative sometimes is when we're eating too much of carbohydrate, it tends to get stored as fat. So if we're not using the carbohydrate that we are eating for energy, it's going to be stored as fat in our bodies. So some rules of thumb when we're looking at carbohydrate in terms of label reading. Some examples of kind of carbohydrates in general would be breads, cereals, grains, fruits, legumes, sweets and sugars. And in terms of label reading, and Nat will touch on this again later on, is we're really looking for those whole grains in terms of carbohydrates. So those will be more nutrient dense and get us the nutrients that we need instead of those, just white breads or white pastas. We should be looking for those whole grains. As well, we should be turning to foods that are higher in fiber. So this fiber will act as like a filler almost, and it's also very, very low in calories. So it's a good alternative to add into our diet so that we feel fuller longer. And then also fruit and veg is part of carbohydrates. And that's simply, there's no added sugar to that. The simple carbohydrate that comes from those fruit and veg is very important. And we'll talk later about how important it is for Canada's food guide. So that half a plate approach with fruit and veg. So in terms of label, label reading, you'll want to stick to those whole grains, high fiber foods, those fruits, those vegetables, milk, yogurt, and legumes. All right. So the second one is protein, or third one, I guess, we talked water, is protein. So generally speaking, we want 10 to 20% of our daily caloric intake to be from protein foods. As part of Canada's Food Guide, they've actually lumped meat and alternatives and milk and alternatives together to make a category called protein foods. So this is really protein is really just to help control hunger and keep us from feeling full all day or feeling full longer. As well, it helps us for our structure of bones, muscles, and tendons, as well with our hormones. So it helps produce insulin. And generally speaking, when we're thinking of food labels or eating proteins, we generally consume enough proteins in our diet to sustain ourselves. So if we're looking for a recommendation, the average need would be 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day. So I would say as a society in general, we tend to lean on protein a little more than we should, and be mindful of that in terms of your needs. because as we know, protein does turn to fat if we have it in excess. As well with protein foods, really important to get a variety of protein. I'll touch on it a little bit next with fats, but a lot of the proteins that we are getting should be from, or some of the proteins should be from plant-based proteins as opposed to those meat proteins. The reason for that is because of different fats that are coming from different types of proteins. So if we are eating a red meat steak, beef steak, it's going to have saturated fats in it that is not very good for our overall health in large amounts. Whereas those beans, lentils, and tofus don't have any of that. So we're trying to kind of push people towards those more plant-based proteins. So in terms of best bite would be choosing legumes more often, so you're not reaching that for that saturated fat quite as often. As well with fish, try to eat it 2 times a week. And the reason for that being omega-3s and omega-6s that come from fish. We can't produce that on our own, so we need to eat it through our foods. As well, try and reach for lean proteins and low-fat dairies and yogurts and things like that. So we're not adding in extra fat when we're reaching for our proteins. And lastly is fat. So oftentimes we don't really think of fat too much. We kind of give it a bad rap, but very, very important for us. It should make up about 20 to 35% of our caloric intake for the day. And it really just helps us makes us feel full and satisfied. As well, for some vitamins, it's necessary to break down that vitamin. And it makes foods, well, to be honest, taste better. So generally speaking, we get a lot of our fats from our diets from oils, things like that we're adding to our foods in preparation, maybe fat at the table, maybe eating processed foods. So maybe potato chips or things like that, donuts that are adding fat into our diet. And then it occurs naturally in some foods such as meat. So I talked about the saturated fat. And cheeses and nuts, avocados, seeds, all these things have natural fat in them. So generally speaking, you want to stick to unsaturated fats. So those are our healthy fats. Those are things like olive oil, avocados, nuts and seeds, fish, all of these things that help us. Whereas those unhealthy fats, those saturated fats and trans fats should be eaten in lower amounts or reduced completely. So those things are the animal fat that we're eating. So if the steak, always has traces of fat or things like that, our butters, our creams, our cheeses will all have fat in them, as well as all those prepared foods will have trans fats in them. All right, and vitamins and minerals, really, if you're eating a balanced diet, you should be getting enough vitamins and minerals into your diet. Where you might need supplements or talk to your doctor further about this would be for those special cases of, pre-pregnancy or post-pregnancy, or if you're a vegan or a strict vegetarian, things like that, where you might be missing out on some of those vitamins and minerals, might be a consideration. But generally speaking, with the foods that we're eating, if we're eating them in the right amounts and the good foods that we need, we should be getting enough vitamins and minerals. And finally is Canada's food guide. So the new food guide kind of shows this balanced plate approach where all of the foods that we're eating, every time we sit down for a meal, should have, half of our plate should be either vegetables or fruit, a quarter should be whole grains, and then a quarter should be protein foods. So if we're sticking to that balanced plate approach, where we're having quality foods, we should be getting enough of those quality foods for us. With this being said, we should be mindful of Canada's food guide when we're looking at labels, so that we're able to kind of gauge what foods we're eating and how much we're eating of them, so that we can kind of steer ourselves in the right direction of reaching Canada's food guide. So generally, half the plate veggies and fruit, a quarter protein foods, choosing those plant-based alternatives occasionally or more often, and then choosing those whole grain foods instead of those white or starchy food carbohydrates. And then always making the water the drink of choice. And now I'll pass it off to Nat for label reading.
All right. Thank you, Braden. And good job. I find label reading kind of the link in between everything that Braden just discussed. So when we break down the foods that we eat when following Canada's Food Guide, again, Canada's Food Guide is a great kind of baseline for that foundation of everyday eating. But when we break Canada's Food Guide down, we're really breaking it down to those nutrients and those different classes of nutrients that Braden just discussed. And how do we know what nutrients we're getting? And that's where the label comes in. So that's going to help us out figure out what nutrients we're getting from the food that we're choosing to eat. So it's a good link from it all. I'd like to start off with kind of seeing the knowledge we have around labels. So let's do a quick poll. Make sure I pick the right one here. Here we go. So poll for you.
Did you click share?
No. There we go. Share now. Thank you, Braden. All right, good. So again, we've got 80% of people who answered. About 44 answered that they're always reading labels, have a good knowledge. Some skim over them a bit, not really knowing perhaps. Hopefully we improve that to the next section. Top section, hopefully we improve your knowledge a little bit. And for those that don't use labels, hopefully we encourage you to do so today. Perfect. So let's do one more label. Let's put one more poll here. Chat. Next thing I want to ask you is how or why do you use labels? So let's check out this poll. Perfect. So again, many different reasons why we choose to use labels or why we use look at labels. So the first one here to compare products. So again, about 40%, probably most do, but again, you've got one choice to make here. But 42% chose to compare two products. Some will use labels in order to avoid certain ingredients. Tends to be when there is allergies or sensitivities to certain foods. And then finally, to try to get a certain nutrient. So again, we can obviously do that as well when we're aiming to get certain nutrients, perhaps the opposite, to avoid certain nutrients. So many different reasons why we can use labels. Good. Let's move on to the next slide.
That was me.
And this expands a little bit on exactly that. You can see the last point on here that wasn't part of the poll is to manage our diets. So again, we can use labels to get a good idea, depending on how much detail you're going to spend on those, to see how many calories we're getting from the foods we eat and different things like that. Good. Next slide. So there's three parts to the label. The first is the ingredients list. So this is the ingredients list, if I can speak here, has to be on the label. So every single label will have at least two of the three parts to the label, the ingredients list being one. It lists products from most to least. So you should get a good idea of what you get in that product from the first two or three ingredients, again, because it's listed from most to least. The other thing to think about with regards to your ingredients list is that the longer that list is, chances are the higher it has been manipulated, meaning It's been things have been added, different things along those lines. And something else to think about is if you can pronounce all the words, chances are it's a bit healthier for you too. So the more you can't pronounce, again, the more it's been manipulated as well. So that's a little bit on your ingredients list. We'll look at that a little bit later on too. Second part is your nutritional claims. Two types of claims, your nutritional content claims and your health claims. And we'll look at that shortly. But this is optional. So the manufacturer has the option, the choice to put this on their label or choose not to. And finally, the third part of the label is your nutritional facts table. And this is what we tend to kind of really think of and look at for our label. Let's look into nutritional claims a little bit more right now. So these are some examples of some nutritional claims, nutrient content claims, one of the two types. So you can see a few of the examples of words that you would see on a product: free, low fat, reduced, light. There's many other options. Health Canada has a great link right from its website that will kind of go into detail of all of them. Key thing with these nutrient content claims is they have to be 100% correct to be put on a label. You won't see anything that is incorrect on a label. With that said, it is our responsibility as consumers to know what those mean. And why I say that is sometimes these content claims, again, they're correct, but they may not be the best choice for us. And we look at a claim, see it, and think it is. Again, it's our responsibility to kind of know what they mean by that word and how to apply it. Let's look at an example. So here's an example where one company chose to use a claim, and the claim is up on the right-hand side here: 25% less than the original, less fat than the original. That can also read as reduced. So the company could choose to put reduced fat. You can see here, just looking at your percent daily value, 6% of fat. When compared to a different product, again, if you're looking to reduce or lower your fat intake, the product number one here is at 1%. So again, just because one company chooses to place a claim on their product doesn't necessarily mean it's better than another product that hasn't chosen to place that claim. So again, it's our responsibility as consumers to kind of know what those claims are all about. So that's a little bit of nutrient content claims. Again, they have to be 100% correct, but it's our responsibility to know more about them.
And really here, I think it's really important to note that the first product is for 4 crackers, but it's 20 grams. And the next is for 6, but it's for 19 grams. So we're comparing the same amount to each other. And I know you'll touch on that, but.
Yeah, we're going to go into good detail on that here shortly. Your second example are health claims. And these claims more or less indicate a relationship between diet and disease. And these have to be correct as well and supported through scientific evidence. You can see at the bottom here an example of one. A healthy diet low in saturated and trans fat may reduce the risk of heart disease. So again, these are health claims that tend to claim a relationship between that product usually and its nutrients and disease prevention or reducing the likelihood of it taking place. So these are health claims. Let's check the next slide, and it goes into a little bit more detail here too. So again, for health claims, there are also kind of third-party health checks and symbols that are used. Key thing to know with these are that similar to my first example on nutrient content claims. So yes, all of these will be probably on the better choice side. However, just because another product doesn't choose to use one of these labels does not mean it's not a better choice. Of course, to use your President's Choice Blue Menu, to use your Heart and Stroke Foundation health check, companies are paying money to have those on their labels. So again, some will not choose to use their funds for that. and simply go with the regular label. So again, it's our responsibility to be able to use the nutritional facts table to compare the two and make the right decision for our needs. So again, these don't necessarily mean that they're the best choice. Another example of a health claim. Perfect. So that's the first two. The last part of the label that we're going to discuss, and we'll go into this in pretty good detail, is your nutritional facts table. Again, this is the tool on the label that we tend to use more often, and this really helps us identify the nutrients that Borden discussed from Canada's Food Guide into the foods that we have. So let's check out the nutritional facts table. So you can see here, I'll catch up here a little bit. Your nutritional facts table has a few different things that I want to talk about. The first thing to do, regardless of which product you're looking at, the first thing to do is look at the top part, same as what Borden did earlier on the example, and that's look at your serving amount or the serving or the amount of food, and that's highlighted here in the blue. Hopefully everybody's computer looks the same as mine. Here you can see for 2 cookies. So if you eat 2 cookies, you're going to get those nutritional values. If you eat 4 cookies, again, you're doubling it, and so on and so forth. If it's the whole row, whatnot, again, you have to make those calculations on your own. But regardless, the first thing you need to do when looking at a product or comparing 2 products is to look at the serving amount and to see how relatively close they are if comparing to 2 products. Second part is to consider how much food you're consuming. And again, be able to make those multiplications and or divisions depending on that. Now, going along with that, the second part in yellow here is calories. So again, those two go more or less hand in hand. You can look at that and make that calculation. The second part here, kind of highlighted in red, is your core list of nutrients. So again, here you can see the nutrients in a little bit of detail that Borden was discussing earlier. You've got your 3 macronutrients, your fat, your protein, your carbohydrates, and then you have a few of your vitamins and minerals and your micronutrients listed kind of throughout. So that's your core list of of nutrients. The label is required to list these 13 nutrients. They can choose, once again, to expand on this and have a longer nutritional facts table with more nutrients, but it is their choice. But at minimum, every label has to have these 13 core nutrients. Finally, the last part here that we're going to talk about is your percent daily value, kind of highlighted in green. This is based on a 2,000 calorie diet, and it more or less helps us identify if there is a lot or a little of a certain nutrient, depending on what we are looking for. And if you can advance the next slide, it'll kind of give us that detail. So exactly that. If there is 5% or less, that's identifying that there is a little of that nutrient. And if there is 15% or more, it's identifying to us that it is considered to have a lot of that nutrient. And again, that's based on a 2,000 calorie diet. A little bit harder to use to make those calculations, but again, it gives us a good idea if there is a lot or a little of that nutrient. So that's a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. In some cases, you want kind of a lot of one nutrient, but a little of another, right? So in terms of fiber, let's say, we're looking for a lot, right? But in terms of saturated and trans fat, we're looking for that 5% or less. So it's really dependent on the nutrient that you're looking at, whether you want a lot or a little of that.
Perfect. Yeah. Sometimes it's individually based, but for the most part, that's exactly it. Most are looking to look for a little of your fat, of sometimes sugars, and usually sodium. On the other hand, when we're looking for a lot, it tends to be in fiber and your vitamins and minerals listed at the bottom. Again, depending on the individual's needs and requirements, but in general terms, that's exactly it. Mm-hmm. Perfect. We're going to now discuss kind of changes to the label. So a few years back, Health Canada decided that it was time for the label to change. And they gave manufacturers a 5-year window to catch up. So we're going to talk about these upcoming changes to the label for one of two reasons. One, we're going to be able to read the new label, but it's also going to give us a good understanding of the current label. So let's move to the first slide here. So if you can see it well, what you're looking at here is the same, pretty much the same label, but from the original, what we're currently using, to what the new label will look like. So again, manufacturers have until 2022 to kind of get rid of the old label and move to the newer version of the label. So you can see there, it doesn't change too much in this kind of sense, but they're going to make a lot of changes in the section around the serving or the amount of food that is listed, and we'll get into that shortly. They're going to highlight the calories and underline them in bold as well, and slightly change a little bit of the micronutrients and vitamins at the bottom based a little bit more on our current health trends today. So again, this is what it will look like. You can also see at the bottom, they're now placing right on there a little bit more on the percent daily value, encouraging us to know to aim for 5 or less for something that we're looking for have low in or a little, and 15% or more identifying that it is a lot of that nutrient. Let's move on to our next example.
And as you go to grocery stores, you will start seeing this label. They do have the option of doing it now. So like if I'm going to the grocery store, I've seen this label on multiple products now. So you'll start to see it more and more over the coming months and years.
Yeah, and I think it's why it's important to go over both of them, kind of how we're doing now, so that we're aware of both.
Yeah.
So if you do have labels, again, feel free to follow along as we're going through this. So let's look at changes coming up to the ingredients list. So this is the same product that you're looking at here on this slide. The original, of course, in the blue, and the upcoming new label in the green. You can see with the original that, again, for me personally, I find it a little bit more difficult to read. So the new one, they are spreading it out, breaking up with the dot in there to identify different ingredients. They are also now, they now have to list all similar ingredients together. So for example, you can see in the old ingredients list, you've got fancy molasses, sugar, and brown sugar all separated. These are all different types of sugars, and they now have to place them all together. So now when looking at the first few ingredients on the ingredients list, sugar is now number 1 versus kind of spread out there. And if we're not sure of all of the terms used for sugar, you can see brown sugar isn't till the 4th one or 3rd or 4th ingredient on the original. So again, making it more user-friendly. So I do find, and I identify it this way quite often, the new label is a lot more consumer-friendly, friendlier for us to be able to utilize more effectively versus the current and or old label that is very much manufacturer-friendly. A little bit more for us to kind of know and be able to utilize to our advantage if we know how. The newer one is helping us with all of the upcoming changes. Good. So that's ingredients list. So the next thing we're going to focus on is, again, that serving section. So they're making many different changes around the serving to help us out as consumers. Again, consumer friendly. So the first one we're going to talk about here are foods that they've identified as single serving containers. So currently, again, the manufacturer can right now choose any serving amount that they want to place on the label. You can see here in the example, this is milk. The container has 473 milliliters. So they've identified this as a product that more than likely we're going to consume all in one sitting, all in one serving. So the original has 250 milliliters, if I can see that correctly. The new one will now have per carton. So if they've identified something to be a single serving container, we are now going to see the entire container listed on there as a serving, and of course, all the nutrients that follow along with it. Previously, we would have to make that calculation. So for this example, you're looking at not quite doubling everything in the container if we are going to drink that entire container of milk, making it more complicated for us to be able to make those calculations. The new label will now have this all listed for us, again, making it easier for us. So that's an example of foods found in single serving containers.
And the deadline to change all these labels is 2022.
Yep.
Sorry, question that came up in the chat.
Okay. I don't have my chat up on there with the pools. There we go. Next example here are foods that can be measured. So here you're looking at the original. You're looking at different yogurts. I can't quite read those, but bottom line is they are different. Maybe I can see it in mine. You're looking at the first example being a third of a cup versus half a cup. So now when comparing the two yogurts, we have to, again, kind of make that calculation in order to be able to compare them. Under the new label, they are now going to have to use a specific amount. With regards to labels, or for yogurt, I'm sorry, they're going to be 3/4 of a cup, 175 grams. So now, regardless if it can be measured, such as yogurt, you can now pick up 2 yogurt containers. The label will be for 175 grams on each and not have to do any calculations and compare the different values. So yes, a lot more consumer friendly, easier for us, not having to do those calculations. Next one here are pieces that can be divided, or foods that come in pieces that can be divided. So here you're looking at crackers. So the original, again, in this one here, you're looking at 2 crackers, one being of 28 grams and the other one being of 14 grams. So again, in order for us to really compare those two products, we have to double it. Again, having to do that math in our head and so on and so forth. Now they have to use a specific amount. So this is going to be listed by weight versus the other one that is going to be by amount. So here for crackers, the weight is going to be near 20 grams. So as close as they can get to 20 grams so that we can compare the two products without having to do calculations. So again, here you've got 21 grams versus 19 grams. We can make that calculation, or we don't have to make the calculation. We can use the label to compare without doing anything. Next one here is the amount of foods that are typically eaten. So with regards to bread, again, right now you see all kinds of different sizes of bread, all kinds of different 2 slices, 1 slice, etc. So that's exactly what you're seeing now, a little bit harder to compare. The new label, again, foods that are typically eaten together are now going to all be the same so that we don't have to do those calculations. For bread, it's going to be 2 slices. So again, if you do have those different, we'll say sizes in bread, at least they're in 2. So if you have that sandwich, you can see exactly the calories, the nutritional content, etc. that you're getting. So let's go through a few different examples now. So we will now look at, it's not going to work out as it typically does when we have animations. But again, here we're going to go through a few different examples. The first one we're going to look at is milk. You're looking at skim milk versus homogenized milk. So again, the first thing to do is when comparing products is to look at what? The amount. So here you can see 250 milliliters, no problems. We can now compare the amount. If we look at, I'll ask it in the chat. In the chat, what are the big differences here between these two products?
Nothing. Oh, there we go.
I'm patient there. Fat content, that's exactly it. And of course, calories to go along with that, right? you can see here 9 grams versus 2.5 grams in the 1% to the 3.25%. Very good. The one thing I will encourage you to write down in that chat is in the fat content, let's look at the homogenized milk label. So in this particular label, we've got 9 grams of fat. 5 is saturated fat and 0.4 is trans fat. Where are the, if I can do my math correctly, the 4 grams that are missing? So in the chat, write down where are the 4 grams that are missing? All right, way to go, Kyle. So that's exactly it. Your label is has to put down your saturated and trans fat. It is not required to put down your unsaturated fat. And if we recall with regards to our breakdown of nutrients, your saturated and trans fat are our bad fats. We want to limit our saturated fats and we want to avoid consuming our trans fats. But again, we want to aim for our unsaturated fats. So the label here is not required to place your unsaturated fats. So what's missing are your good fats. Okay, so that's a little trick and tip to look at with regards to fats. Very good. Let's look at our next example. Here we're looking at hummus and Nutella. Okay, so we're going to look at some different spreads, some different dips that you can use for different things. So take a quick look at this and tell me what you see. What are the differences? What are you looking at here with regards to hummus and Nutella? I wanted to do this in the kitchen here so I can pull it all out of my cupboards, but the kids are upstairs. Perfect. So the first thing is to look at the amounts. So you can see under the hummus is 2 tablespoons and under the Nutella is 1 tablespoon. So right off the get-go, if we really want to compare these 2 products, we either have to divide the hummus or multiply the Nutella, right? Divide it in half or double it. So the first thing we need to do is to be able to do exactly that. We also have to consider how much we're actually going to spread on our pita, on our rice cake, whatever the case may be that you like to use. So chances are you are not using 2 tablespoons regardless of what you're using. So again, you'd have to kind of do that calculation as well. But if we now double your Nutella, you're looking at over double the calories, double the fat, right? Again, 6 grams in the hummus versus 12 grams now in the Nutella. So another item I want to push you towards is, let's see here. Let's look at the carbohydrate. So you're going to see this in the next example, but it highlights it well here. So in your carbohydrates, let's look at your Nutella. Or we'll look at your hummus. So you've got 5 grams of carbohydrates in your hummus. 2 fiber, 0 sugar. Where are the other 3 grams? Anybody want to guess? 3 types of carbohydrates. There we go. All right, good job. Randy, Kyle, and Filler. Well, close. But you're looking at your starch, your complex carbohydrate. So that's exactly it. So once again, the label is only required to place your simple sugars and your fiber. It does not have to put your complex carbohydrate, your starch on there. So another little tip to look at. Typically, for most, we're looking at more complex carbohydrates than our simple sugars. So that's another tip to look at with regards to that section of the label. Very good. Next one here. I've got these in the house as well. Lucky Charms and Cheerios. So let's compare these two. So do the exact same. Take a quick look over those and identify that it's kind of highlighted for you here without the animations, but point out a few differences. Amounts of grams per, yeah. So again, that's serving size. So I find this quite, it happens quite often when looking at cereals. So why would one company want to not place, for example, here a full cup? Why would somebody want to put the 3/4 cup when you're looking at Lucky Charms versus Cheerios? It's more or less to be able to have them more comparable in certain areas. You can see here too much sugar to lower their bad content. That's exactly it. So some companies are going to choose to place certain amounts so that it's more comparable to other products. When the change comes to, and everybody has to use the new label, you're not going to see it that way anymore. Cereals are going to have to be under the exact same amount so that we're really able to compare and look at those differences. If we look at it right now with the 3/4 cup for Lucky Charms versus the full cup for Cheerios, your carbohydrates look fairly similar. But again, if we were to do the multiplication, add a 25% to those Lucky Charms, you're going to offset that. You're going to look at your simple sugars as pretty much 12 grams, if not a little bit more, if I'm doing my math correctly here, versus your 6. So you're looking at doubling the simple sugars and so on and so forth. So that's exactly it. So again, with the newer label, we won't be doing this. We'll be simply looking at the label and comparing them product for product and not having to kind of go through these little tricks that the manufacturers are currently using, if they're still using the same or the current label. Very good. Let's look at our last one. Last one, we're going to look at wraps and bagels. So what do you see here for the difference? This is, you might not be able to compare them exactly the same with the new label, but again, we're still looking at breads here. Bagels are a lot larger, right? 85 grams. So again, even using Canada's old food guide, where they identified a little bit more on serving sizes, a bagel, a full bagel, was equivalent to 2 serving sizes. Your wrap here being of 34 grams. So even if we double it, you're looking at doubling that, and it's a little bit equivalent to the bagel, but it's not quite there. We'd have to almost double it in a half. Same amount for sugar and fibers. Yeah. The other thing that I really like to point out is, again, carbs or bagels have their kind of have that bad label out there, right? It's kind of, oh, you can't have your bagels. But if you look at your breakdown of your carbohydrates, what are you looking at? Very little simple, quite a bit of your complex carb, of your starch, right? How I kind of find that the bagel gets the bad ingredients on it is what we put on that. All that cream cheese or whatever spread, kind of like we touched on earlier, whatever you're putting on there, right? So if we really look at it, we're getting a fairly good breakdown here of complex carbohydrate, low amount of fat, and probably even a little bit of protein, 8 grams of protein. So something else I encourage a lot of people to do around protein is look around your labels to see where you're getting a little bit more protein. You can see here 8 grams in your bagel. Pasta has a little bit of protein. So we tend to get enough protein from our diets, no problem. Very good. So we went through about 4 different examples on how to compare and utilize labels right there. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a better understanding. I'm going to go through one more poll here with you. So did this label section help? Did you learn a few other tricks?
Not only with the upcoming changes, but also like when you're actually at the grocery store now, you can kind of pick up an item and be able to kind of compare products or know what you're looking at.
All right, good. So it looks like most picked up a few tricks. So I'm glad that that worked out. So again, the whole purpose of going through labels is to get you more comfortable with making informed decisions at the grocery store, at home, etc. Again, it's a good link from Canada's Food Guide to those nutrients that that we need. It helps us make those informed decisions when able to do so. So today we touched on a little bit of a review of those nutrients, and we touched on Canada's Food Guide. And then we went into good detail on label reading, which is the major teaching point for this session. So again, hopefully, as you just identify, you did get a few extra tips and tricks to really make those informed decisions at the grocery store and when comparing products.
All right, so today we went over label reading. Next week, we're actually going to use this a little bit more and talk about menu planning as well as grocery shopping. So how can we grocery shop and menu plan to have better nutrients in our diets? I've put up a link to register for our next week course on next Tuesday at the same time, 10:30 to 11:30. So click that and put in your email and contact information, and you'll get an email to register for the next event. As well, here are a few resources that we can provide to you as the CAF community. Canada Food Guide as well as unlockfood.ca, both really good resources if you want more information, not only on labels, but also nutritional facts, nutrients, all these things. The new food guide, if you don't know that too well. As well, other resources that are available during this time of COVID-19 that might be helpful for you. I'm also going to put up a few other polls. So the first one is I feel I can apply what I've learned into my daily living. And then the next one is just about Demio. So how satisfied you were with the Demio platform. If you could just note those. A few questions that are coming into the chat are, where can we find the slides again? So the recording will be available on CAF Connection under HP Webinars under the national platform that you can review later. And then I never thought, yeah, okay. Any other questions from today's session that you might have? If not, thank you so much for listening to our presentation today. Next week, menu planning and grocery shopping. And then the week after will be about stress eating and kind of how to plan our meals better. All right. Have a good week, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.